there's been a lot of very high quality intellectual content thus far, so I thought we needed to change that. I don't work for governments. I generally get along poorly with most politicians. I placed a call on time, which we eventually took out of their dead clutching hands and put on the World Heritage List. That sort of set a bad relationship, kind of paradigm between me and guns. And eventually that resulted in them hitting myself and a whole bunch of other people, Pepe, Putt here, with Australia's big slap suit. They sued for $6.8 million. I was defendant number one. The case was called Guns versus Marr and others. But the others were a whole bunch of the best actors in the country. So they actually picked on the wrong people. But it did take about 3 or 4 years to ultimately resolve. But one of the ways we resolved it, I am getting to Triabunna, but you need to understand this, otherwise you won't quite appreciate the humour that is, for me, forever associated with Triabunna these days. In 1985 I hated Triabunna because they were trashing a place called Farmhouse Creek. These wonderful forests were being destroyed in front of us. I was up a tree for 16 days at the time until the police came and arrested me. And I said, where are these trees going? They said, Triabunna. And it was this big evil monster woodchip mill, the biggest woodchip on the southern hemisphere, through good capacity 1.3 million tonnes, chewed up 40,000 log trucks a year of old growth forest for its entire operational life, every year. So I hated the place, I hadn't been there, but I didn't like it. Anyway, so eventually, to get rid of this slave suit, we had to persuade guns to drop the case. Now, this was not going to be easy. They really didn't like us. We've done a whole number of things they found annoying, like messing up all their pulping plans and all sorts of things. Anyway, so the result of all that was we collectively ran a campaign in Japan with some friends of ours from San Francisco called the Rainforest Action Network. And eventually the Japanese customers went completely nuts. It took a few years because the Japanese don't go nuts quickly, but when they do, it sort of tends to last for a while. So eventually, just that combined with, well, we did talk to the banks, and ANZ wouldn't lend them the money for the pulp mill. We did talk to their investors, and the investors eventually sacked the CEO, Robin Gray, who was on board. And I actually came in a couple of weeks and taken out the board, that's another story. Anyway, so eventually, the company had to drop the court case, and as part of that, the new manager was told to get out of native forest, and they said to him, this is the investors said, not only do you have to get out of native forest, if you're not well out of native forest in 6 months, we're not just going to sack you, we're going to close this company down because they had absolute belly for you. You're dead. Get it done. So these guys eventually sent him off, and he did start getting out of native forest. And one of the first things he had to do was get rid of all their native forest logging equipment, like the Triabunna Woodchip Mill. Now, Triabunna Woodchip Mill was the second woodchip mill built in Australia, started in about 1973 in operation. As I said, had a throughput of 1.3 million tonnes a year, and operated, it averaged 800,000 tonnes a year over the entire 35-year life of the plant. Anyway, as usual, what happens is the loggers get together and do this sneaky little deal. So a nice little deal was done to hand over the Triabunna mill to another bunch of loggers who set up a series of $20 companies that the state government agreed to lend $6 million so that they could afford to buy this thing, so that they could then afford to subsidise it through Forestry Tasmania so the thing could keep operating. Because no one could imagine the world without Triabunna operating. Anyway, eventually, we persuaded Guns not to sell to these guys. They signed a contract for $16 million. In the end, they sold it to a company that I ended up working for, Triabunna Investments, for $10 million. This is really a tale of two quite extraordinary people, Jan Cameron and Graham Wood. They put up $5 million each to buy this thing. And I said, well, look, I just cannot see how you can possibly make money out of this. And they said, we don't care. We don't care. We'll just $5 million. No problem. And anyway, you know, when is this going to happen? And they said, well, look, there is some good news. Oh, yeah, what's that? And they said, well, we've appointed a new general manager. and the Pepe went, oh, fantastic, who is it? Up you go. She just went off her tree and said, you cannot have a vegetarian in charge of an abattoir. Well, bad things will happen. And on they went. Anyway, so this created a whole lot of hysteria. Some people, I didn't feel treated with respect that a captain was normally a cool. But, you know, I'm used to not being fully game. Anyway, but what it did mean is I got to be Mr. Big when I went to Woodchip conferences. I used to get into these conferences, only captains and ministers could go to, and I'd turn up. And some logger from Australia started abusing me in front of these bemused other loggers from around the world who couldn't understand why the Australian captains of industry are having a difference of view. And I try to look at this bloke's crutch and say, the problem is Woodchip never big enough. Because I've got 1.3 million tonnes. You know, most of these Vietnamese guys, it's like 500,000 tonnes or someone else has got 800,000, 1.3. Serious stuff. Anyway. So I had a lot of fun there, and in the process of all that, I got all the industry data, all the projections, all of the markets, all the emerging markets, all the markets that are in trouble, what the prices are, who the buyers are, and going, hello, what could go wrong here? All sorts of things. Throw a spanner in here and watch that big fly over there, that's great. So we had a lot of fun, these Woodchip conferences. And I picked up a lot of very useful information. One of them is that the reason that the Australian Woodchip market's through the floor, and is never coming back, is because the Vietnamese and Thais are taking the market. Simple as that. They're delivering stuff into China for half the cheapest stuff, even with all the subsidies that Australian producers can do. So that's never going to change. Simple as that. Cannot be fixed. So we saw a lot about the economics of this stuff this morning. There has been a fundamental shift in the demand. The Japanese will not accept uncertified wood into Japan on any scale. So, you know, the days of when Australia overall was exporting 8 million tonnes of wood chips a year, which gave them rivers of gold to fight the environmentalists to keep the whole thing going, are dead. But here's some of the many lessons from Triabunna, regardless of the fact that it was going to cost these guys, they were going to lose $5 million a ship to export wood chips out of Triabunna. They couldn't wait to do it. Couldn't wait to do it. They did everything they could to get it reopened. And they even had major environment groups offering to help them run a campaign against me to get Triabunna reopened. Can you believe it?
Oh, yes.
Believe it, mate. It happened. But couldn't wait to lose $5 million a shipload because they just can't imagine what else would happen. And what we saw at Triabunna in the end is the owners said to me, you need to start the decommissioning process. So let me assure you it's well advanced. And it's been officially signed by the Environmental Protection Agency. So the Tasmanian government itself has approved the decommissioning plan, and the decommissioning is well advanced. So I'm confident that the Triabunna Woodchip Mill, the operators of Woodchip Mill, are pegging. Just to let people know that things can fundamentally change. And a couple of the left, you're going to have exactly the same cultural problems and irrationality in dealing with Eden, but all of the underlying problems that sat there for Triabunna are also there for Eden. I believe the main thing that Eden is trying to do is hold on long enough to get burning forest for electricity up, as Eden did, and that's what Forest New South Wales wants as well. The woodchip market, as we know, is dead. So that's something to consider. And market campaigning is the future. That's exactly why Eric Cadets wants to make it illegal. And just one last little thing, the Tasmanian World Heritage Area was expanded in June last year to put many of the most important areas of forest inside the World Heritage Area. And the current national government and the new Liberal government of Tasmania, which will be after 15th March, are determined to take those forests out so they can lock. So I'll be working with a whole bunch of people, both in Australia and internationally, to make sure that doesn't happen. So anybody who's interested in helping on that, all hands will be greatly appreciated. Anyway, keep the work up to Eden, because Eden's never been more vulnerable than it is now. The opportunities are there, and I think there's enough expertise in the environment movement to finish the job.
There's something in this report that we released last year at Moments for Change, the proposals to burn forests for electricity. So this, I'm not going to go through, the slideshow is not actually a whole slideshow about this report. I do have a few copies here, not many, but I just want to use a couple of the slides that are in there. I guess the general, with all we've heard today, which I'm not going to recap, I'm just hoping you remember it all, burning native forest material to tackle climate change is patently absurd. We've got the information here that Keith gave us about retaining carbon in forests and avoided emissions, and also the additional sequestration you can get from allowing forests to regenerate. But of course, if you burn forests to create electricity, you're sending those emissions straight into the atmosphere. And the material to be used is, of course, in substantial volumes, essentially to substitute for the collapsed woodchip export trade, which Francis Perkins and others have talked about. And this is an even shorter lived product than what woodchip exports contributes to. That goes to pulp and paper, and the lifespan somewhere between 1 and 3 years, but of course this is immediately into the atmosphere. And furthermore, it's likely that utilising native forests for electricity generation or for making biofuels is going to actually remove even more material from the forest than woodchip exports has done. So we have the idea that somehow the industry will be retained in native forests by continuing this use of the so-called residues, which actually constitute somewhere between 80 and 95% of what's coming out of the forest. And that species that aren't actually suitable for wood chipping could, however, be perfectly suitable for burning, and so can lots of the even smaller parts of the tree that don't get used in the wood chip trade. So even more devastating in relation to the forest, as well as putting an even greater carbon load into the atmosphere. How do I do this?
You were great.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So this is basically what's being planned, and I'll go through these different things in a moment. But I guess that the key message for this conference is I'm not going to talk about all the other environmental issues and social issues around this, but simply that this is not carbon neutral. Yet it's being deployed, biomass burning, as a renewable energy in some jurisdictions around the world internationally to meet renewable energy targets, which are meant to be tackling climate change. In Australia, as you probably know, we had a bit of a tussle about it a few years ago, and it's not at the moment eligible for the renewable energy target or for renewable energy credits. And what the Australian government said in relation to this in March of 2013 was wood waste from native forest was removed from the RET as an eligible renewable energy source in 2011. This amendment was made to ensure that the RET did not provide an incentive for the burning of native forest wood waste for bioenergy, which could lead to the unintended outcomes for biodiversity and the destruction of intact carbon stores. Who knows what's going to happen with the review of the RET that's just been announced. I think we're all somewhat fearful that the loggers are looking again for some sort of a break to get this going. So I'll just go over some of the other accounting stuff if you didn't think it was narrowly enough already. How come this notion of carbon neutrality, this complete misapprehension that somehow burning forests for power is carbon neutral? Well, apart from the fact that you hear the loggers say drastically oversimplified, ridiculous things like you cut a tree down when it grows again, therefore it's all carbon neutral. Forgetting completely that we might be looking at an entire forest and time frames to take action on climate change, and a century or two is actually not something that's in the picture in terms of tackling human-induced climate change. We've got a few other issues. The accounting at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and in fact under the Kyoto Protocol, has accounted the burden of forests for electricity generation and the burning of biofuels as zero in the energy sector. It's counted as zero emissions, but that's because it's assumed that the emissions will be accounted for in the land use change in the forestry sector. The problem is that there are major flaws in that accounting system that have allowed countries to avoid accounting for emissions from this type of logging and use during the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. Rules have been now changed for the second commitment period. However, they haven't alleviated the situation very much because they're full of even more bizarre laws and weirdnesses, especially for Europe. And this is very pertinent about Europe because Europe is basically the leader that's been driving the use of biomass as well as biofuels as substitutes for fossil fuels in some crazy notion that it might help alleviate climate change. Well, it might help to meet some targets anyway, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's made a good difference. So they've got policy settings in Europe that encourage the use and in fact are leading to increasing installation of facilities and of co-firing in arrangements in coal-fired power stations to burn forests for electricity. And that's already having a significant impact, of course, within Europe on their forests, but also very significantly in the natural forests of the southern United States of America, where there is quite a massive volume in trade beginning to happen, or has been happening for some while, and also out of Canada, the natural forests of Canada. Increasingly also there are eucalypt plantations for the manufacture of pellets to go to Europe and elsewhere out of Brazil for biomass burning. And in Portugal, they're suffering this massive explosion of eucalypt plantations all across the country, which nature conservation groups are trying to fight. And this is specifically also for bioenergy and in particular for pellets for this burning. During the second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol, the Europeans calculated what the expected, or for this period, they calculated and brought to the negotiations the expected emissions that would happen from their forests if they do additional harvesting and harvest at increased rotations over the next period in order to supply enough to do all the biomass burning they want to do. And it looks, when you look at those calculations, it looked just like that graph that we had from the first speaker today of business as usual. It sort of went up like that. So they got a business as usual projection that involved quite massively increased emissions and said, well, we'll use that as our baseline to measure against. So rather than measuring against historical emissions and trying to bring something down between below what we were in 1990, instead they've said, okay, all these increased emissions are going to become the baseline. If we fail to increase our emissions as much as we predicted, we'll get a credit. Isn't it great? And so that's how we still have all this really tortured, weird stuff around the accounting of bioenergy. There's a different system for Australia, and in fact different countries can adopt different systems for doing the accounting. So you can imagine people are all choosing to invent a system that's sort of pretty good for them. I've just come back from Europe, where I went to the big bioenergy meeting of European groups, where there would have been about about 2 or 3 times as many people as at this meeting from all across all the countries in the EU, from a range of all non-government organisations. They're really clear that, clearly saying they recognise now, although it took them a while, that biomass burning is not carbon neutral. They are very opposed to the use of biomass burning to coal-fired power stations because it simply keeps coal-fired power going. And they say that when wood eventually finds its way to being burned for energy, it should be at the end of a cascade of use, which starts with high value long-term wood, and when it eventually comes down the cascade, perhaps one day it might be acceptable to burn it, and they're also quite strong now on the biodiversity impacts. Now, to go to the threats that we're looking at, this is basically what's proposed in relation to biomass burning. I can't actually see that one, but so I'm going to find it here. So there's some talk in Australia about doing this one, processing native forests into liquid or gaseous biofuels as a fuel substitute used for transport fuels. There's been a bit of work done on it. There's a facility at Harwood in mid-north New South Wales that's having a bit of a go at that, at working on that, but it's very much, people with a few drums in a shed sort of a scenario at the moment. But could of course be quite dangerous if it gets legs. More what we've seen is domestically these proposals here to take the native forest and use it for electricity generation, often by making pellets to burn, or possibly even by just utilising wood chips or whatever in the power station and generating electricity. So that's quite large volumes for major power generation. As you know, we've also held this off for a number of years around Australia. Since the late 1990s, there have been these sort of proposals talked about, but nothing's come to fruition, and conservation campaigns have successfully gotten potential energy retailers to say they don't want to be involved in what's become known mostly as dead koala power. And in Tasmania, I guess we call it dead some other animal power. That's that one, and that's still live, and that's where what happens with the renewable energy target is going to be quite significant, because really, for this to go at all, it does require some type of government incentive or subsidy or some sort of policy setting that assists it, because it's really not an economic option. We also have the issue that we're beginning to see potentially a bit of an oversupply of electricity, so again that makes it a bit difficult at the moment. However, what the industry, I've been going to industry conferences because we're a markets group. I've got to figure out what they think the market's doing and see what we can do about it. They are now saying that because it's proving difficult to get big projects off the ground, that probably the thing to do is to take a stepwise approach and start with small local projects that everybody will love, like heating the local swimming pool or heating the hospital. And when everybody's been softened up to doing that and having smaller scale pellet plants that get that happening, then we'll move to the big stuff. So look out for that happening. It's not to say that there isn't potentially some place for that on the smaller scale stuff, although I would be rather reluctant myself. I've heard some people say, well, it wouldn't be as bad, obviously, as big scale stuff, but when you think of this, the thin end of the wedge, then it's a bit of a worry. The other thing then is this pellet. Really, Japan is constantly where we need to worry about, and of course it's our traditional customer of our native forest wood as well. The industry, just to finish up, is looking at establishing port facilities. They're already doing this in the US, where they amalgamate the supplies coming from different companies and different suppliers from different forests, all into one area in a port where they can get into a bigger ship. They're also looking at torrefied wood pellets, which would be particularly for Asia. Probably in Europe they've missed that boat because the facilities aren't built for that. So that is charcoalized pellets, so you can concentrate the amount of energy. And furthermore, they're saying it would be really good if we could export out of places like Newcastle or somewhere where coal's coming from, because what we could do is just get the big coal ship and then put
start talking about much more is forest carbon. We really
Thanks, Mike. Hello, everyone. As a staff entered, I'm another captain of industry, albeit a really, really small, what I like to call a small, not for loss business. That's yet to achieve its goal. I entered, after I finished work in Tasmania on the independent verification process a year or so ago. I was approached by the chairman of a company that was called Red Forests at the time to see whether I'd be interested in taking over management of the business. And I was interested because there are no examples of anyone that's ever protected any forests for the carbon benefits. And the spaces to actually engage in a policy sense with forests and carbon are few and far between. And it's frankly, I think, an area where there's under-involvement from most NGOs. Again, if you focus on climate change, most NGOs, and you arguably quite rightly focus on how to reduce fossil fuel consumption. And as Pepe and I, in former life, did a lot of work in the international climate negotiations, which is where all those very bizarre rules that Andrew McIntosh talked about earlier come from. And unless you engage in the international space, you actually can't easily influence from the bottom up, from the country level up. They are top-down processes. And that's very poorly understood. Anyway, I thought, I'll get engaged at the bottom up. I'll go into the only company that's actually done this stuff and see what they're doing and see what avenues that opens up for creating more examples that people know. Forest Alive operates solely in the private sector. So there are, for those of you who don't know, there are significant holdings of private native forests in Tasmania, northern New South Wales, which I think northern New South Wales, about 90% of the wood now comes out of private native forests, and southeast Queensland. Smaller patches in other states, very little in Western Australia, very little in Victoria. But nevertheless, if we are going to see forests protected as a climate solution, you need some examples somewhere. And I thought, well, this will be a reasonable place to start. And in fact, what I discovered was an extraordinarily small team, highly talented young people. They are really outstanding for their integrity, their commitment to the environment, and then a very interesting bunch of landowners who were the first people in the world to protect forests as a climate solution. Forest Alive, or Red Forest as it was then, did the very first voluntary projects in the world to protect forests as a climate solution. We have the very first Australian national carbon offset standard credits of any sector, the very first. So they were, in a sense, they were global leaders and on a very steep learning curve. The methodology that was used, and it goes through laborious international processes through the Verified Carbon Standard, which is the standard we're currently in, was developed in Australia. And it's like a science experiment. In fact, we are conducting research, and one day, in the not too distant future, we'll have very good data because we've got more plot sites across our 38,000 hectares of forest than Forestry Tasmania can have. We've got 1,400 plot sites. They're all measured, they're all randomly generated. We've got the most extraordinary logging history, going back in some cases 30 years, on which the baselines that establish additionality that Andrew McIntosh also talked about this morning are based. And there's a whacking rate discount that comes off them for market uncertainty and for other forms of uncertainty. And at the end of the day, they still generate, and this is net, so this is emissions net of sequestration, they generate 280,000 tonnes of carbon credits for across 13 landowners in Tasmania each year, and that's annualised, so that's averaged credits because words, it's not a certain volume each year, it's a certain number of events over the 25 to 30 years of these projects. They are phenomenally expensive to develop, phenomenally expensive to maintain. Every year we go through another, and the methodology itself was independently verified. Then there's a separate validation process with a different set of independent auditors, and then each year you've got to use another set of independent auditors who you train, frankly, to go through the whole methodology and the whole process again. Last year, which was our third verification, took 9 months of full time to start. It's ridiculous, completely ridiculous. The verification really needs to be, should be simple. Is the forest still there? Is it damaged? But no, so there are some lessons I think we've learned through this process that are relevant to the kinds of issues that Andrew McIntosh was talking about this morning in terms of how do you actually encourage people to take action in this sector. Forget, and I've put to one side the issue of offsets, what we're offsetting, all of those issues that were raised by the science. There is such a long way to go on this journey to have the policy settings truly reflect the science. The comment that I think was just one slide that Pepe put up, and I think Mark is involved in this, and Brendan Mackey and Judith Jones, looking at what a really robust accounting framework would be, and that stock-based accounting that they're working on. We are such a long way from having that. And as I said, the space to engage with it is in the international arena if you want to achieve it. Yes, you might get some vague interest at the domestic level, but while ever the international rules are the way they are, there will be no change. So there's a massive task ahead to ensure that one day accounting for carbon in natural ecosystems actually reflects the value of those carbon stocks. So meanwhile, back at the coalface, I think the experience that I'm having with Forest Alive right now is probably never been more valuable as we move from a pricing scheme to a still evolving direct action scheme. I think it truly is critical to have examples in a whole range of sectors of how to help reduce emissions, and that's one of the things I think that will be interesting with direct action as it attempts to encourage people in all sectors to reduce emissions, how that's going to happen when it's least cost. A lot of the land and forest projects are anything but least cost. The various tree planting organisations that I talk to say they can't break even at under $12 a tonne. People are talking in the marketplace about, least cost abatement being $3 to maybe $6 a tonne. That's not going to open up a lot of opportunities in the land and forest sector. Potentially there's low cost abatement in the public land and forests, but there are so many other policy barriers to achieving that. I think it's going to be a very, very difficult space in which to see a hell of a lot of change from the status quo. I must say I've been really impressed by the amount of effort that is going on within the bureaucracy and Hunt's department into trying to work out how best to deliver good outcomes. That's been, I suppose, a surprise to me because I found dealing with the CFI process under the previous government incredibly frustrating, extraordinarily frustrating. I could not develop a single private rainforest protection project. And that wasn't, only became apparent to me in December that that was the case. It's an extraordinarily leadership that's been shown by both this little company and 13 Tasmanian landowners who are involved in it will end up somehow or other in the emissions reduction fund or eligible to enter the emissions reduction fund. It's still not clear to me though exactly how, and I'm not sure that it's clear to anyone yet exactly how. So I have been spending a lot of time talking to the federal bureaucrats, doing submissions into the green paper, and trying to work out how we take some of these baby steps forward for carbon and forest. And that's really all I think I'm doing, is trying to ensure that there's a foothold for forest protection somewhere in the climate mitigation space. But what that foothold looks like and how satisfactory it is remains to be seen, but there has to be a foothold. So I guess that's what I'm fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you to be here today at the Forest and Climate Forum. My apologies that I can't be there in person. I've been asked to share some observations on the important role of state governments in action on forest and climate, and particularly from the state of New South Wales. It's clear that the themes being discussed here today are of global significance. The protection, management and conservation of forests and woodland has a crucial role to play in responding to the threat of climate change and conserving forests for their natural and cultural values. In Australia, we need leadership at both the national and state level for decisive action to protect our forests and woodland and to reduce carbon emissions from our country dramatically over the coming decades. It's clear that we need greater leadership from the federal level, but the states also have a key role to play in this process. We know from history, from experience, that states can and should be innovators in this area. In New South Wales, the state government introduced one of the first emission trading schemes in the world in the early 1990s. Our states can and should be at the forefront of policy on climate and the protection of our native forests. We know also from experience that state policy makes a difference. In Queensland alone, the introduction of land clearing laws and a reduction in broad-scale land clearing has played a critical role in reducing carbon emissions from that state. Between 1990 and 2011, overall carbon emissions from Queensland declined by about 8.6%. But if you remove the contribution of land use and forestry from those figures, Queensland's emissions increased over that same period by more than 70%. So, but for action on the protection of woodlands and forests in Queensland, emissions in that state would have increased between 1990 and 2011 by 70%. So action on the protection of woodlands and forests through the introduction of robust land clearing laws has played a critical role in managing what would otherwise have been runaway increases in industrial electricity emissions across Australia, and particularly in states like Queensland and New South Wales. So we know that state policy matters. We know that our state governments can be leaders in this area, but that at the current moment, we are sorely lacking in leadership at both the state and federal level. The states have a critical role to play in the protection of our forests and woodlands. In the first instance, as legislators and regulators, they have the power to protect our forests and woodlands through laws like the land clearing laws in New South Wales and Queensland. They also own and manage very large areas of land, state forests, protected areas, national parks, and also extensive areas of crown land across each state. States also have decisions to make about where they invest their resources and the influence that they have on industry development in sectors like forestry. So the states are a key player in this process. The states must be actively involved in crafting solutions for the protection of our forests and woodlands, for nature and for the climate. In New South Wales, we, the Nature Conservation Council, have been working actively in recent years with local and regional organisations including our member groups like the South East Region Conservation Alliance, the North Coast Environment Council and the North East Forest Alliance, to bring together local and regional campaigns with state policy analysis and action on state legislation. I'd like to speak briefly about 3 key issues for New South Wales in the area of forest and climate. The first of those is forestry and forestry regulation. The second is the increasing impact of coal and gas development on natural areas, including our forests and woodlands. And finally, the emerging threat of rollbacks of our land clearing laws. Our Forest Working Group, including our local and regional members, have been working actively on a range of issues and threats in the forestry area this year. Our state forestry agency has been corporatised, but it continues to log our native forests at a loss. Their most recent annual report revealed yet again a multi-million-dollar loss in the native forest logging sector. Meanwhile, their plantation operations and the plantation sector generally continue to perform strongly as an economically sustainable alternative to destructive native forest logging. We've maintained pressure throughout the year for an accelerated transition towards a more sustainable forestry sector in New South Wales, one that doesn't rely on economically and environmentally unsustainable forest destruction. We've responded actively to proposals to burn native forest biomass for energy and also gearing up to defend threat species protection laws in our public native forests. Our state and others have seen an unprecedented expansion in fossil fuel development in recent years, including coal and unconventional gas. In New South Wales, there are 2 natural iconic areas that right now are on the front line of this contest between environmental protection and climate action on the one hand, and the destruction of natural areas for coal and coal seam gas development. Lead forests and the Pilliga are the focus right now of non-violent direct action aimed at protecting those areas from destructive coal mining development in the case of lead forest and an enormous coal seam gas field in the case of the Pilliga. We stand in solidarity with those groups. We've supported their direct action, their legal action, and also advocated very strongly for the protection of important natural areas like Pilliga and the lead forest, and for the need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Between now and the state election, introducing strong controls on fossil fuel development, including protections for natural areas, will be a key focus for us. Also in that period, we'll be fighting to defend some of the most important environmental laws in our state. The New South Wales state government has signalled its intention to conduct a root and branch review of our land clearing and threatened species laws. We see the defence of our state land clearing laws in New South Wales and in Queensland as a critical part of the fight to protect our forests and woodlands and to reduce carbon emissions over the coming decade. The unwinding of land clearing laws will have the perverse effect of not only degrading water catchments, increasing the risk of salinity and destroying wildlife habitat, but also actively undermining national action on climate change and perversely costing the federal government potentially tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in additional expenditure through its proposed direct action plan to reduce carbon emissions. Returning to the bad old days of land clearing in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria and other states is a foolhardy proposition, and it's a very direct threat to the protection of our forests, woodlands and climate. Thank you once again for the invitation to speak today, and my apologies for not being there in person. I hope to see you at the next Forest and Climate Forum. Thank you.